The early morning sun cast long shadows across the private aviation terminal as Dr. Sarah Mitchell's Tesla Model S glided smoothly into the exclusive parking area. The clock on her dashboard showed 6:45 a.m., exactly an hour before her scheduled departure. Sarah always believed in being early, a habit that had served her well throughout her career as one of the country's top neurosurgeons. Just 12 hours ago, she had completed a complicated 16-hour brain surgery that other doctors had deemed impossible. The patient, a young father of 3, would now live to see his children grow up. Such successes were why Sarah loved her job, though she rarely spoke about her achievements. As she stepped out of her car, her heels clicked softly against the polished concrete. At 42, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of proving herself in operating rooms and medical conferences. Her dark skin glowed in the morning light, and her carefully braided hair was pulled back in a professional style that had become her trademark. The terminal building stood before her, all glass and steel, reflecting the rising sun. Sarah adjusted her cream-colored Burberry blazer, a gift she had bought herself after her first successful solo surgery 10 years ago. Beneath it, she wore a simple blue silk blouse and tailored black pants. Her style was elegant but understated, just like her personality. A young valet approached, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized her from a recent medical magazine cover. "Good morning, Dr. Mitchell," he said warmly, reaching for her car keys. Sarah smiled and handed them over, along with a generous tip. She never forgot how it felt to work service jobs during her college years. From the trunk, Sarah retrieved her matching set of Louis Vuitton luggage. Inside one bag was her presentation for the International Neurosurgery Conference in Los Angeles, where she would share her latest surgical techniques with hundreds of other doctors. In another was the special surgical tool she had invented, which was revolutionizing brain surgery procedures across the country. As she walked toward the terminal entrance, Sarah checked her phone. 3 messages waited. One from her mother wishing her a safe flight, another from her assistant confirming her hotel arrangements, and a third from the conference organizers asking if she could add a second speaking session due to overwhelming demand. The morning air was crisp, and Sarah took a deep breath, enjoying the peaceful moment. Her mind wandered to the speech she would give later that day. She had worked hard to make complicated medical procedures understandable to everyone, just as her own mentors had done for her years ago. Other travelers were starting to arrive now, business executives in expensive suits, chatting loudly on their phones about stocks and profit margins. A few nodded at her in recognition. Sarah had operated on either them or their family members. She returned their greetings with a gentle smile but kept walking. Despite her success, she never felt the need to network or show off her status. Near the entrance, Sarah paused to help an elderly woman who had dropped her boarding pass, bending down to retrieve it despite her expensive outfit. The woman thanked her profusely, and Sarah chatted with her briefly, learning she was flying to see her first grandchild. These small human connections were what Sarah valued most, even on busy days. Checking her watch, 6:55 a.m. now, Sarah approached the terminal doors. Her flight would take off in 50 minutes, giving her plenty of time to go through security and review her presentation one last time. The morning sun had fully risen, warming her face through the glass walls. Little did Sarah know that behind those gleaming doors, an encounter awaited that would test her patience, challenge her dignity, and ultimately show the world what true grace under pressure looked like. But for now, she was simply Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a brilliant surgeon heading to share her knowledge with others. Her mind focused on saving lives and making the world a little bit better, one operation at a time. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, welcoming her into the terminal. Sarah stepped forward, ready to start another day of making a difference in the world. The private terminal's interior was quiet and luxurious, with soft lighting and comfortable leather chairs scattered throughout the waiting area. As Sarah walked toward the security checkpoint, she noticed how other travelers moved freely through the space, their passage smooth and unquestioned. Security guard Tom Reynolds stood at his post, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a face set in permanent disapproval. He had worked at the terminal for 15 years, and in his mind, he knew exactly what a private jet passenger should look like. When he saw Sarah approaching, his eyes narrowed, and his hand immediately went to his radio. "Ma'am, this is a private terminal," Reynolds called out loudly, his voice echoing across the marble floor. Several heads turned to watch. The regular commercial terminal is in the next building. He stepped directly into Sarah's path, his security badge glinting under the lights. Sarah reached into her designer bag, already anticipating what was coming. She had experienced similar situations before, though rarely so blatant. "Good morning," she said calmly, her voice steady and professional. "I have my credentials right here." She held out her passport, pilot-approved ID, and boarding documents. Reynolds barely glanced at the documents. Behind him, a white businessman in a rumpled suit walked through without showing any ID at all. "These could be fake," Reynolds said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "We need to verify everything. Where did you get these papers?" Sarah noticed a young female employee behind the counter watching the scene with growing concern. Meanwhile, more passengers were passing through, none of them being stopped or questioned. Some avoided looking at the scene, while others watched with uncomfortable expressions. "These are standard credentials issued by your company," Sarah explained patiently, though she felt her heart beating faster. "I fly through this terminal regularly. Would you like to scan them?" She maintained eye contact with Reynolds, refusing to be intimidated. Reynolds crossed his arms. "And how exactly did you get access to private aviation?" "These jets are very expensive, you know." His emphasis on expensive made his implications clear. Behind him, the young employee had picked up her phone and appeared to be making a call. Sarah took a slow, deep breath. In her years of medical practice, she had learned that responding to ignorance with anger only escalated situations. "I understand you're doing your job," she said, her voice clear enough for others to hear, "but your current approach seems inconsistent with how you're treating other passengers." This seemed to anger Reynolds further. "Listen here," he started, his face reddening. "I don't know how you got in here, but—" "Is there a problem with my documentation?" Sarah interrupted calmly, pulling out her phone. "If so, I'm happy to call Gerald Thompson, the CEO of this aviation company. He was my patient last year during his emergency brain surgery. I'm sure he can verify my credentials." Reynolds blinked, confusion crossing his face. A few feet away, a couple of other travelers had stopped to watch, their expressions varying from embarrassment to outrage at his behavior. The young employee behind the counter was now walking quickly toward them, papers in hand. "Dr. Mitchell is a regular client," the young employee, whose name it agreed Jessica, said as she approached. "She's also part owner of our medical transport division." Jessica's voice trembled slightly, but she stood her ground beside Sarah. The color drained from Reynolds' face as he finally really looked at the credentials in his hand. There, clearly printed, were Sarah's medical credentials and her partial ownership details. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, looking like a fish out of water. Sarah simply held out her hand for her documents. "Thank you for your diligence," she said, her voice professional but cool. "Though in the future, you might want to apply it equally to all passengers." She turned to Jessica with a warm smile. "Thank you for your assistance." As Sarah walked past the security checkpoint, her heels clicking confidently on the floor, she could hear Reynolds stammering excuses behind her. But she didn't look back. She had a conference to prepare for, lives to save, and knowledge to share. This man's ignorance was not going to take up any more of her valuable time. Despite Jessica's intervention, Tom Reynolds wasn't done yet. His pride was hurt, and like many people who held onto small amounts of power too tightly, he couldn't stand being proved wrong. He quickly walked after Sarah, his security badge jingling with each step. "Ma'am, we still need to do additional security checks," he called out, his voice carrying across the terminal. The other travelers, who had been pretending not to watch, now turned to stare openly at the unfolding scene. Reynolds was creating exactly the kind of disturbance that private terminals usually worked hard to avoid. Sarah stopped walking and turned around slowly. Through the terminal's large windows, she could see her jet waiting on the tarmac, its white surface gleaming in the morning sun. She was scheduled to give her keynote speech in just 4 hours, and this delay was becoming more than just an annoyance. "What additional checks do you need?" she asked calmly, watching as another group of passengers, all white executives, walked straight through to their gate without any inspection. One of them even carried a cup of coffee, which was technically against security protocols. Reynolds pulled out a thick manual from his security desk. According to Section 7.2, he began, flipping through pages he had probably never read before, "We have the right to conduct random additional screenings." His emphasis on random made several nearby passengers shake their heads in disgust. Sarah glanced at her watch, an elegant Cartier timepiece that had been a gift from a grateful patient's family. "I see," she said, her voice carrying the same tone she used when teaching medical students. "And how many random screenings have you performed today?" The question made Reynolds shift uncomfortably. A well-dressed older woman sitting nearby spoke up. "He hasn't stopped anyone else all morning. I've been here for 2 hours." Her comment caused Reynolds to turn an even deeper shade of red. Just then, the terminal's glass doors opened, and a familiar face walked in. It was Marcus Chen, one of Sarah's former residents who now worked as a neurosurgeon at a nearby hospital. He spotted her immediately and smiled, then noticed the tension in the scene. "Dr. Mitchell," he called out warmly, walking over. "Are you heading to the conference in LA? Your paper on minimally invasive brain surgery techniques is revolutionary." He stopped beside her, his presence adding another layer of credibility to her already impeccable credentials. Reynolds looked between them, his authority crumbling by the second. More passengers had gathered now, some openly filming the interaction on their phones. The young employee, Jessica, had returned with what appeared to be a supervisor. "Of course," Sarah said to Marcus, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard clearly, "but Officer Reynolds here feels the need to perform a random additional security check. Perhaps you'd like to wait and see if he'll be randomly selected as well." Her slight emphasis on the word random made several observers hide their smiles. The supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Linda, according to her nameplate, finally reached them. "Dr. Mitchell, please accept our sincere apologies," she said, shooting a sharp look at Reynolds. "There's been a serious misunderstanding. You're clear to proceed to your gate." Reynolds started to protest, but Linda cut him off with a stern look. "That will be all, Mr. Reynolds. Please report to my office immediately." Her tone left no room for argument. As Reynolds sulked away, Sarah turned to thank Linda, but the supervisor was already speaking into her radio, calling for immediate replacement security personnel. Around them, the other passengers began to return to their own activities, though many were now on their phones, no doubt sharing what they had just witnessed. "Well," Marcus said with a slight smile, "some things never change, do they? But you handled that brilliantly, as always." He picked up one of her bags, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the gate. Sarah allowed herself a small sigh. "No, some things don't change," she agreed. "But that doesn't mean we stop moving forward." She straightened her shoulders and continued walking, her heels clicking against the floor with renewed purpose. Through the windows, she could see the sun rising higher in the sky, promising a new day and, hopefully, better things to come. As Sarah and Marcus walked toward their gate, Sarah's phone buzzed in her hand. The terminal's events had already made their way to social media, with several passengers sharing videos of Reynolds' behavior. Her own phone showed 3 missed calls from the aviation company's corporate office. "You should probably take that," Marcus said, nodding at her phone. He remembered his days as her resident, how she always taught them to handle difficult situations with grace. Now, watching her deal with this incident, he understood why she was not just a great surgeon, but also a natural leader. Sarah found a quiet corner near their gate and answered the 4th incoming call. It was Gerald Thompson himself, the CEO of the aviation company. His voice was filled with concern and embarrassment. "Sarah, I just heard what happened," Gerald said, his usual confident tone replaced with genuine worry. "I'm watching the security footage right now. This is completely unacceptable." Sarah could hear other voices in the background, suggesting an emergency meeting was already in progress. "Gerald," Sarah replied calmly, watching as other passengers boarded their various flights, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm more interested in preventing this from happening to others than dealing with this single incident." She paused, an idea forming in her mind. A group of young medical students walked past, their eyes widening in recognition. They had probably seen her name on the conference schedule. One of them whispered excitedly to the others, pointing out her recent publication in the medical journal. "Actually," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the same tone she used when proposing new surgical techniques, "I have a suggestion. Instead of just firing Reynolds, why don't we use this as an opportunity for change?" Gerald was quiet for a moment, listening as Sarah outlined her plan. She suggested implementing a new training program, one that would address unconscious bias and promote inclusive behavior among all staff members. As she spoke, she opened her laptop and began typing notes, years of multitasking in the operating room, making it second nature. "That's actually brilliant," Gerald said when she finished. "Instead of just removing one person, we create systemic change." He paused, then added, "But we're still firing Reynolds. Some behaviors can't be tolerated." Sarah smiled slightly, remembering how she had saved Gerald's life during an emergency surgery last year. He had been a different person since then, more open to seeing the bigger picture. "Send me the proposal by next week," she said. "I'll help review it between surgeries." As she ended the call, Marcus returned with 2 cups of coffee from the terminal's premium lounge. "Everything okay?" he asked, handing her a cup. He had already added just the right amount of cream, remembering her preference from their long surgery days. "Getting there," Sarah replied, taking a grateful sip. "Sometimes the best response to ignorance isn't anger, it's education and change." She checked her watch again. Their flight would begin boarding soon. Around them, the terminal had returned to its usual quiet efficiency, but something had shifted. The other passengers gave her respectful nods as they passed, and the security staff at their gate seemed extra attentive and professional. Jessica, the young employee who had helped earlier, approached them nervously. "Dr. Mitchell, I just wanted to say, watching you handle that situation was inspiring. I'm actually studying to be a nurse, and I hope I can be as professional under pressure as you were today." Sarah's expression softened. "What's your specialty going to be?" she asked, genuinely interested. As Jessica excitedly explained her plans to work in pediatrics, Sarah listened attentively, ignoring the continuing buzz of her phone. "They're calling our flight," Marcus noted a few minutes later, as the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Sarah stood, gathering her belongings with practiced efficiency. "Keep in touch, Jessica," she said, handing the young woman her business card. "The medical field needs more people who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right." As they walked toward their gate, Marcus shook his head in admiration. "You just turned a racist incident into a teaching moment, a systemic change opportunity, and possibly mentored a future healthcare professional. How do you do it?" Sarah smiled, pulling out her boarding pass. "By remembering that every challenge is an opportunity to make things better for those who come after us." She stepped forward as the gate agent called first class, ready to board the plane and face whatever came next with the same grace and determination she had shown all morning. While Sarah and Marcus were boarding their flight, the private terminal had erupted into a flurry of activity. Linda Thompson, the supervisor who had intervened earlier, sat at her desk reviewing the security footage with growing concern. On her computer screen, multiple email notifications popped up from corporate headquarters. The footage was worse than she had imagined. From different camera angles, she could clearly see Reynolds stopping only certain passengers, a pattern that couldn't be ignored. His confrontation with Dr. Mitchell was just the latest in what appeared to be a long string of discriminatory behavior. "Miss Thompson?" Jessica knocked on her office door, holding a tablet. "The video is going viral. It's already got 50,000 views on social media." She turned the tablet to show Linda the trending posts, many of them praising Dr. Mitchell's composure while condemning the terminal's security practices. Linda rubbed her temples, feeling a headache coming on. In her 20 years of aviation management, she had never faced a situation quite like this. The phone on her desk rang again, the 4th call from corporate in the last hour. "Get me Reynolds," she said to Jessica. "He should be in the break room." As Jessica hurried out, Linda answered the phone, listening as the company's PR team outlined their crisis management strategy. Meanwhile, in the break room, Tom Reynolds sat alone, his face ashen. His phone kept buzzing with notifications, friends and family members sending him links to the viral videos. Some were asking if that was really him. Others were expressing disappointment. His daughter, a college student studying social justice, had already sent him 3 messages asking for an explanation. Jessica appeared at the break room door. "Mr. Reynolds? Miss Thompson needs to see you immediately." Her tone was professional but cool. Just last week, Reynolds had helped her carry some heavy boxes, and they had chatted about their favorite baseball teams. Now, that friendly relationship seemed like a distant memory. As Reynolds walked to Linda's office, he passed the spot where he had confronted Dr. Mitchell. Other security staff had taken over his post, and they were checking everyone's credentials equally and professionally. A line of diverse passengers moved smoothly through security, exactly as it should have been all along. Linda's office door was open, but Reynolds knocked anyway. "Come in, Tom," she said, not looking up from her computer. On her screen, a video played silently, him questioning Dr. Mitchell while letting others pass freely. "Sit down," Linda said, finally looking at him. Her expression was a mixture of disappointment and determination. "Corporate has made their decision, but first, I want you to understand exactly why this happened." She turned her monitor so Reynolds could see it clearly. "We're going to watch all of your interactions from the past week, every single one." She clicked play, and Reynolds was forced to watch himself in action, his biased behavior clear and undeniable. After 20 minutes of footage, Linda paused the video. "Tom, you've worked here for 15 years. Did you really think nobody would notice this pattern?" Her voice was steady but firm. Reynolds shifted in his chair. "I was just trying to maintain security," he mumbled, but even to his own ears, the excuse sounded hollow. "No," Linda corrected him, "you are profiling passengers based on your personal biases. Dr. Mitchell isn't just a respected surgeon. She's part owner of our medical transport division. But even if she wasn't, your behavior would still be unacceptable." She pulled out a folder and placed it on her desk. "The company has decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately, but they're also doing something else." She handed him a brochure. "Dr. Mitchell suggested that instead of just firing you, we should create a new training program. She believes people can learn and change." Reynolds stared at the brochure, titled Aviation Security, Ensuring Equal Treatment and Professional Service. His hands trembled slightly as he held it. "You'll receive your final paycheck and standard severance," Linda continued. "But I want you to think about something. Today, you lost your job, but Dr. Mitchell turned your mistake into an opportunity to help others learn. That's the difference between maintaining power and showing true authority." As Reynolds left the office for the last time, he passed Jessica again. She was hanging a new poster near the security checkpoint. It showed diverse travelers being treated with equal respect, with the company's new slogan beneath: "Safety through equality. Every passenger, every time." At 35,000 feet above the ground, Sarah sat comfortably in her first-class seat, reviewing her presentation slides one last time. Marcus, seated across the aisle, noticed she hadn't mentioned the morning's incident once since they boarded. Instead, she focused on preparing for her keynote speech about new surgical techniques that could save thousands of lives. "Dr. Mitchell," a flight attendant approached with a tablet in hand. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's something you might want to see." She handed Sarah the tablet, which showed a news website. The headline read, "Renowned neurosurgeon faces discrimination at elite airport terminal, responds with grace and innovation." Below the headline was a series of video clips from different passengers' phones. Each showed a different angle of her interaction with Reynolds. The comments section overflowed with support, but what caught Sarah's attention were the responses from other professionals sharing similar experiences. "It's gotten over 1 million views," the flight attendant said softly. "My daughter's in medical school, and she just texted me saying you're her new hero." She paused, then added, "Mine too, actually." Sarah handed back the tablet with a gentle smile. "Tell your daughter to focus on her studies. The medical field needs strong, confident doctors of all backgrounds." The flight attendant nodded, visibly moved by Sarah's words. As she returned to her presentation, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Jessica, the young employee from the terminal. It included a photo of the new equality poster being installed and a simple message: "Change is already happening. Thank you." Marcus leaned across the aisle. "You know, when I was your resident, you taught us that the most important part of being a doctor isn't just treating symptoms. It's fixing the underlying cause." He gestured at the messages flooding both their phones. "Looks like you just performed another successful operation." Sarah thought about his words as she looked out the window at the clouds below. The morning's incident had been unpleasant, but the response it generated might help prevent similar situations for others. Sometimes, she reflected, the best treatment required looking at the bigger picture. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into Los Angeles. As Sarah packed away her laptop, several other passengers approached her seat. They were a diverse group of professionals who had witnessed the incident at the terminal. Dr. Mitchell, a young Asian businessman, said, "I've faced similar situations but never knew how to handle them so professionally. Would you consider speaking at our company's leadership conference about maintaining dignity under pressure?" Before Sarah could respond, an elderly white woman added, "I'm on the board of 3 private aviation companies. After seeing what happened today, I'm going to propose mandatory anti-bias training at our next meeting. Your composure was remarkable." A black teenage girl, traveling with her father, shyly approached. "I want to be a doctor too," she said quietly. "Everyone told me it would be too hard, but watching you today showed me how to be strong." Sarah looked at each of them thoughtfully. In her 20 years of medicine, she had learned that healing wasn't just about surgical procedures. Sometimes it was about showing others what was possible, about standing firm with grace, about transforming negative experiences into opportunities for growth. "Thank you all," she said warmly, "but the real change happens when we each do our part to make spaces safer and more inclusive for everyone." She turned to the teenage girl. "And yes, becoming a doctor is hard work, but you're strong enough to do it." As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, Sarah received one final message. It was from Gerald Thompson, the aviation company CEO. "Board approved your training program proposal. Budget unlimited. You just changed our entire corporate culture in less than 6 hours. Not bad for a day's work, Dr. Mitchell." Sarah smiled as she gathered her belongings. In a few hours, she would share life-saving surgical techniques with hundreds of colleagues. But she had already helped create a different kind of healing that morning, the kind that happened when people chose to respond to discrimination not with anger, but with dignity and constructive action. By evening, the morning's events had spread far beyond the private terminal. Sarah's phone kept buzzing during breaks at the medical conference, but she remained focused on sharing her surgical innovations with fellow doctors. Her presentation was a success, with the audience giving her a standing ovation for her breakthrough techniques in brain surgery. During the lunch break, Sarah noticed her name trending on social media. The videos from the terminal had been viewed millions of times, spawning thousands of comments and discussions about discrimination in professional spaces. News channels were picking up the story, praising her composed response to prejudice. Dr. Mitchell, a conference organizer, approached her table, where she sat with Marcus and other colleagues. "We've received numerous requests for you to give an additional speech tomorrow. Not about medicine, but about handling discrimination in professional settings. Would you consider it?" Sarah took a sip of water, considering the request. She hadn't planned on becoming the face of this issue, but she understood the importance of the moment. "Yes," she replied, "but I'd like to focus on creating positive change rather than dwelling on negative experiences." Meanwhile, back at the private terminal, things were changing rapidly. The company's corporate office had called an emergency meeting to address the situation. Linda, the supervisor, presented the security footage to the board members, along with Sarah's suggested changes for systemic improvement. The video of Reynolds' behavior had sparked an internal review of security practices across all their terminals. Other employees began sharing their observations of similar incidents, leading to a complete overhaul of security protocols. Jessica, inspired by Sarah's handling of the situation, had started organizing discussion groups among terminal staff. During their lunch breaks, employees shared experiences and suggestions for creating a more welcoming environment for all passengers. The aviation company's social media team posted a public statement. "We apologize for the incident involving Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Thanks to her suggestions, we're implementing comprehensive anti-bias training and reviewing all our security procedures. We're grateful for her professional response and willingness to help us improve." By late afternoon, major news networks were running the story. They highlighted not just Reynolds' discriminatory behavior, but more importantly, Sarah's dignified response and the positive changes it sparked. Educational institutions and corporations began calling, requesting copies of the new training program Sarah had proposed. Sarah's former patients started sharing their own stories online. A congressman she had operated on last year tweeted, "Dr. Mitchell saved my life with steady hands and exceptional skill. Today, she showed the same steadiness in fighting discrimination." Her response turned a negative incident into positive change. Back at the terminal, Reynolds' daughter arrived to help him clean out his locker. As they packed his belongings, they watched the new training video being shown to all staff members. Reynolds sat quietly, finally seeing his actions through others' eyes. "Dad," his daughter said softly, "maybe this is a chance for you to learn and grow too." She handed him a flyer for a community diversity awareness program. Reynolds took it silently, tucking it into his pocket. The terminal's atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Security staff greeted every passenger with the same professional courtesy, regardless of appearance. Jessica proudly wore a new pin on her uniform that read, "Respect first, safety always." By evening, Sarah's medical conference presentation had been overshadowed by her morning experience. But she didn't mind. During the conference dinner, she received an email from a major medical journal requesting an article about maintaining professionalism in the face of discrimination. "You started something important," Marcus told her as they reviewed the day's events. "That incident could have ended with just one person being fired. Instead, it's creating waves of positive change." Sarah thought about the young girl on the plane who wanted to become a doctor, about Jessica studying to be a nurse, about Reynolds' daughter trying to help her father understand his mistakes. Change happened in many ways, she realized, sometimes through grand gestures, sometimes through quiet dignity. As the sun set over Los Angeles, Sarah finally checked her personal email. Among the hundreds of messages was one from her mother. "Baby, I watched that video. You handled it just like I taught you, with grace and strength. But you did even better. You turned it into a teaching moment for everyone. I'm so proud of you." 1 month after the incident at the private terminal, Sarah sat in her office at the hospital, looking at the changes her experience had sparked. On her desk lay a stack of letters from people around the world who had been touched by her story. Each shared their own experiences and how her response had inspired them to handle discrimination differently. The private aviation company had completely transformed its approach to security. Their new training program, developed with Sarah's input, was now being adopted by other airports and businesses across the country. The program focused not just on preventing discrimination, but on creating a genuinely welcoming environment for everyone. Jessica had been promoted to head of customer relations at the terminal. She turned her small discussion group into a formal employee committee that met weekly to discuss ways to improve passenger experience. Their first initiative, greeting every passenger with the same warm welcome, had already received positive feedback. Sarah picked up a framed magazine cover from her desk. It showed her in her surgical gear, with the headline, "Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Healing Bodies and Changing Minds." The article inside discussed both her medical innovations and her impact on workplace discrimination policies. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. He was implementing similar training programs at his hospital, inspired by what he had witnessed that day. "Another hospital just called," his message read. "They want to adopt our new equality guidelines. Your influence keeps growing." Surprisingly, Sarah had also received a letter from Reynolds' daughter. She wrote about how the incident had opened important conversations in their family. Reynolds had enrolled in diversity awareness classes and was slowly beginning to understand his biases. His daughter thanked Sarah for responding in a way that created opportunity for growth rather than just punishment. The young girl from the plane who wanted to become a doctor had started a social media group for minority students interested in medicine. Sarah had agreed to be their mentor, offering monthly online sessions to answer questions and provide guidance. The group had grown to over 1,000 members in just a few weeks. Gerald Thompson, the aviation company's CEO, had turned their experience into a case study for corporate training. Companies from various industries now used the video footage, both of Reynolds' discrimination and Sarah's response, to teach employees about professional behavior and constructive responses to bias. Sarah's mother had framed the news articles about the incident and hung them next to Sarah's medical school diploma. "Both show different kinds of healing," she told her daughter proudly. "One for the body, one for society." As Sarah prepared for her afternoon surgery, she thought about how a single morning had created such widespread change. The incident had been unpleasant, but her response had turned it into something positive and lasting. The aviation company reported that complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped to zero in the past month. Their new slogan, "Dignity in the Sky," reflected their commitment to treating every passenger with respect. Other transportation companies were following their lead. Sarah's medical conference speech about handling discrimination had been viewed online more times than her groundbreaking surgical presentation. While she was proud of both, She understood that some forms of healing went beyond the operating room. That afternoon, Sarah received news that her story would be included in a textbook chapter about professional ethics and leadership. The authors wanted to show how maintaining dignity under pressure could transform negative situations into opportunities for positive change. Looking out her office window at the hospital grounds below, Sarah saw a group of medical students walking to class. They were diverse in every way: gender, race, background. Each of them would face their own challenges, but maybe her story would help them handle those moments with grace and strength. Her assistant knocked on the door. "Dr. Mitchell, your next surgery is ready, and there's a school group here for the medical career program you started. They're very excited to meet you." Sarah smiled, standing up and putting on her white coat. The incident at the terminal had lasted less than an hour, but its effects would continue touching lives for years to come. She had shown that the best response to discrimination wasn't anger or despair, but calm determination to create positive change. As she walked toward the waiting students, Sarah thought about how every challenge was an opportunity to make things better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. That morning at the terminal had taught her that sometimes the biggest impacts come not from grand gestures, but from simply choosing to handle difficult moments with dignity and grace.